Here's a question worth sitting with. If you're a man in your 40s suddenly getting attention you never got in your 20s, what actually changed? You or the market you're standing in? Most guys assume it's them. They finally got their life together, finally look like something. Maybe. But there's a colder, more useful explanation sitting underneath that one, and it has nothing to do with your character and everything to do with supply, demand, and timing. This is Robbin, and this is the Honest Ledger. Today we're opening the books on how dating leverage actually shifts across a couple of decades, for men and for women both, and what that means for how you read interest, timeline pressure, and your own standards when the attention you're suddenly getting doesn't match the attention you used to get. One thing needs to be said clearly, and I'll only say it once. This isn't a video that claims to know what any specific woman secretly feels, resents, or is privately settling for. Nobody gets to make that call about a person they've never met, and neither do I. What we can talk about honestly is how dating markets function at a population level, and how to read genuine interest versus circumstantial interest in the actual person sitting across from you, a skill that has nothing to do with age or gender and everything to do with paying attention. Let's open the ledger. The first entry in the ledger is the basic mechanics of how a dating market behaves, because market isn't just a metaphor here. It functions the way markets function anywhere. When one side of a market has abundant, low-cost options, that side gets to be selective. When the available options shrink, the leverage shifts toward whoever's still standing with something to offer. Independent research on dating apps has consistently found that attention skews heavily by age. Platforms like Hinge and OkCupid have published data showing that men's response rates and message volume tend to peak, then decline as they get older, while women's patterns run in something closer to the opposite direction, with older women generally receiving less inbound interest than they did in their 20s. And men's outbound success rates in some data sets actually improving into their late 30s and 40s, particularly for men with financial stability. Exact figures vary by platform and year, so treat the direction of the pattern as the finding, not any single number. What this produces mechanically is that the same person can experience wildly different levels of romantic attention at 25 versus 40% without anything about their fundamental worth having changed at all. Only their position in a market that's constantly reshuffling based on age, life stage, and what each side is optimizing for at that moment. On the ledger, attention, priced by market conditions far more than by any individual's inherent value, which is worth remembering whichever direction it's currently running in your favor. It's also worth saying plainly that this cuts in both directions across a lifetime. The same dynamics that shift leverage toward men later in life shifted it away from them earlier, and neither version of that curve is a moral judgment on anyone standing inside it. Markets reward position and timing constantly, in dating the same as anywhere else, and understanding that is protective rather than cynical. The second entry is what this means specifically for men who find themselves suddenly getting attention in their 40s that they didn't get in their 20s or 30s. It's tempting to read that shift as evidence you finally became more attractive. And maybe some of that's true, since career stability and confidence genuinely do read as attractive qualities that often develop with age. But a meaningful part of what's happening is structural, not personal. As people move through their 30s, the pool of what each person considers a top-tier match tends to shrink faster than the pool of people looking, which increases competition for a narrower set of options and pushes more attention toward people who weren't previously in the running. Picture a man who spent his 20s sending dozens of messages for every reply and assumed that ratio was just permanent, then finds, 15 years later, that women are messaging him first. The honest read isn't, I transformed into someone irresistible. It's closer to, the market I'm standing in has fewer available high-demand options than it used to, and I'm now a more competitive one. What this costs a man who misreads this entirely is either false humility, assuming he still has no options and undervaluing genuine interest when it shows up, or the opposite mistake, assuming every bit of new attention is really about him personally when some of it is about circumstance. On the ledger, an accurate read of your own position, which protects you from both underselling and overestimating yourself. There's a version of this that gets men into real trouble in either direction. The man who assumes he's still invisible and lets genuine interest pass him by out of old habit, And the man who assumes the new attention is entirely a personal transformation and lets it inflate his sense of his own leverage past what the actual situation supports. Both mistakes come from the same root: not updating the model of yourself to match the actual current evidence. The third entry is learning to distinguish timeline pressure from genuine interest in the actual person in front of you. And this is a skill worth having regardless of anyone's age or gender, because timeline pressure comes from all kinds of places: a family health scare, a friend group that's all getting married, a fertility clock, a lease ending, a milestone birthday. None of those pressures are shameful, and none of them automatically mean the interest isn't real. But they're worth noticing as a separate variable from attraction itself. Some signals worth paying attention to in anyone: does the pace of the relationship match how well they actually know you? Or does it seem to be running on an external clock that would move at the same speed with almost anyone reasonably compatible? Do they talk about you specifically, your actual habits, your sense of humor, the things only someone paying attention would notice, or mostly about the milestones the relationship is hitting? Picture a man dating someone who brings up moving in together within a few weeks in a way that feels driven more by "I need this settled" than by anything specific about him. That's worth a direct, calm conversation, not a silent verdict. What this costs a man who never learns to notice the difference is that he can end up structuring his life around someone else's deadline without ever finding out whether the two of them were actually well matched, independent of the timing. On the ledger, clarity about pace and motivation, which only comes from paying attention and asking directly, not from assuming. It's worth adding that timeline pressure and genuine feeling aren't mutually exclusive. Someone can be under real external pressure and also be developing real, specific affection for you at the same time. The goal isn't to treat urgency as automatically disqualifying. It's to make sure you know which parts of the relationship's pace are about the two of you and which parts are about a clock that would be ticking regardless of who is standing next to them. The fourth entry is the fertility biology itself, stated plainly because it's genuinely relevant and there's no honest way to talk about dating timelines without it. Female fertility declines with age in a well-documented, medically established way. Most research puts natural per-cycle pregnancy odds somewhere in the range of 20 to 25% for a woman in her 20s, dropping to somewhere around 10 to 15% by the late 30s, and considerably lower again after 40, with miscarriage risk and pregnancy complications also increasing with age. These are averages with real individual variation, not a countdown that applies identically to everyone, and modern fertility medicine has changed some of what's possible at later ages too. But the underlying biological trend is real and worth knowing for men and women both, if children are part of either person's plan. Male fertility declines much more gradually by comparison, though it isn't unlimited either. Research has linked older paternal age to modestly increased risks of certain conditions in offspring, a fact that gets far less airtime than the maternal side of this conversation, but is worth knowing too. What this costs anyone who avoids this topic entirely is decision-making at one of the most consequential points in their life, done without accurate information. On the ledger, biological reality, which doesn't care about anyone's dating philosophy and is worth factoring in honestly, rather than avoiding out of discomfort. This is uncomfortable territory precisely because it can be misused as a pressure tactic, as a way to rush someone, as an excuse to treat a person's value as tied to their reproductive window. None of that is the point here. The point is simpler. Two adults making a major life decision together deserve accurate information, the same way they'd want accurate information about any other significant, time-sensitive choice. The fifth entry is the fallback trap, and this one runs in both directions, not just toward men. Being someone's fallback, the option chosen because the preferred alternatives stopped being available rather than chosen on your own specific merits, is a real risk in dating at any age. And it's worth being honest with yourself about whether you're seeing genuine interest or convenient interest in a given relationship. The signals aren't about someone's age or history. They're about how the relationship actually behaves. Constant comparison to an idealized alternative, visible disappointment when reality doesn't match what was hoped for, a pace that seems driven by urgency rather than genuine connection. Picture a man who notices his partner frequently references an ex or an idealized version of a life she didn't get, in ways that leave him feeling like a placeholder rather than a choice. That's worth naming directly rather than absorbing quietly for years. What this costs a person who ignores these signals is investing real time and emotional energy into a relationship built on default rather than genuine selection, which tends to surface as chronic dissatisfaction on one side and quiet resentment on the other, regardless of who's older or who's more established. On the ledger, being chosen versus being settled for, worth actually knowing the difference in your specific relationship, rather than assuming either one based on demographics. The sixth entry is unspoken scorekeeping, which is really the toxic cousin of the ledger motif this whole channel is built on. The difference between an honest, open accounting between two people and a silent one nobody's allowed to see. A relationship where one partner is quietly measuring the present against an idealized past or an idealized alternative without ever naming it tends to produce chronic low-grade dissatisfaction that has no clear resolution, because the comparison is never actually put on the table where it could be discussed. Picture a couple where one partner privately wishes their life looked more like a friend's or more like an old relationship and never says so directly. Every ordinary evening gets quietly measured against that unspoken standard and comes up short. What this costs both people is a relationship that can't actually improve because the real complaint is never voiced in a form the other person could respond to. On the ledger, resentment accumulating in a column neither partner can see or settle, which is a fundamentally different and more corrosive thing than an honest disagreement stated plainly. The cruelty of unspoken scorekeeping is that it's usually invisible to the person doing it too. It doesn't feel like keeping score. It feels like a series of small, private disappointments that never quite rise to the level of something worth bringing up, until they've accumulated into a verdict about the whole relationship that was never actually tested against reality. The seventh entry, and the one that should give you real hope if the rest of this feels heavy, is that relationship research doesn't actually support the idea that how a relationship starts determines how it ends. Longitudinal research on marital satisfaction, including work associated with researchers like John Gottman, has consistently found that the strongest predictors of long-term relationship success are things that happen after the relationship begins, how conflict gets repaired, how much genuine appreciation exists day to day, whether both partners turn toward each other in small moments, not the circumstances or motivations present at the very start. Picture two couples where one met through mutual friends after years of searching and the other met almost by circumstance, neither one's initial type. And 5 years later, the couple that's actually thriving is determined far more by what they built together than by how urgently or casually they started. What this means practically is that even a relationship that began under real timeline pressure or that started as someone's second choice rather than their first can become something genuinely mutual and strong, provided both people are actually building it honestly together rather than one person carrying a silent resentment the other never gets the chance to address. On the ledger, this is the entry that actually pays out. The origin story of a relationship matters far less than most people assume, and the ongoing choices matter far more. The eighth entry is your own standards, and this is worth saying directly to the men watching this specifically. Just because someone is interested in you doesn't obligate you to reciprocate, and just because attention feels novel after years of not getting much of it doesn't mean every version of it deserves your investment. You're allowed to evaluate compatibility, character, and genuine mutual interest the same way you always would, regardless of how flattering the sudden attention feels. Picture a man who spent years feeling overlooked, finally gets consistent interest, and says yes to the first several people who show it, mostly out of relief rather than actual compatibility. What this costs him is time spent in relationships chosen for the wrong reason, his own version of settling driven by scarcity rather than genuine fit. On the ledger, your own standards, worth holding on to regardless of which direction the market happens to be running for you at the moment. The ninth entry is the broader cultural habit of framing dating itself as a competition with a winner and a loser, which distorts how people on both sides read their own relationships. A lot of the discourse around dating markets, leverage, and who won or lost at different ages treats romantic partnership like a zero-sum contest, where someone ending up with an ordinary, decent partner is framed as a consolation prize rather than a genuine outcome worth wanting. That framing does real damage in both directions. It can make a person feel like they're constantly auditing their partner against a hypothetical better option, and it can make a person on the receiving end of that scrutiny feel perpetually provisional, like a placeholder who hasn't quite earned permanent status. Picture a man who's internalized this competitive framing so thoroughly that even a genuinely good relationship gets filtered through, "Did I do as well as I could have?" instead of, "Is this actually good for me?" What this costs anyone who adopts this lens is the capacity to actually be present in a relationship that's working, because the lens itself is built to keep scanning for a better deal rather than to register satisfaction when it's already there. On the ledger, contentment spent down by a framework that was never built to allow for it in the first place. The reframe is to notice when you've slipped into treating your own relationship like a performance review against a hypothetical alternative, and to consciously ask a different, better question instead, not, "Could I have done better?" but "Is this actually good on its own terms?" Add it all up, and here's the full ledger. What an accurate read of this whole picture gets you. Attention understood as market conditions rather than a referendum on your worth. An honest read of pace and motivation instead of assumptions. Real biological facts factored into major decisions instead of avoided. An eye for the fallback dynamic in either direction. An understanding that unspoken scorekeeping corrodes a relationship far more than an honest disagreement ever could. Real research showing that a relationship's origin doesn't determine its outcome. Your own standards held steady regardless of how flattering new attention feels. And freedom from a competitive framing that keeps you scanning for a better deal instead of registering the good one you're already in. Now here's what you actually do with this. First, when you notice a shift in the attention you're getting, resist the urge to explain it with a single story. Whether that story is, "I finally became irresistible," or "This must be desperation." Hold both possibilities and actually get to know the specific person in front of you before deciding which one applies. Second, name timeline pressure directly when you notice it in a calm, specific way, rather than either ignoring it or silently resenting it. "I've noticed we're moving quickly, and I want to understand what's driving that for you," opens an honest conversation instead of forcing you to guess. Third, get the real biological facts if children are part of anyone's plan for both partners, and treat that as a practical conversation to have honestly rather than a topic too uncomfortable to raise. Fourth, watch for the fallback dynamic through behavior, not demographics. Constant comparison to an idealized alternative, visible disappointment. Urgency untethered from actual connection. And address it directly if you see it, rather than assuming it based on someone's age or history. Fifth, if you notice yourself keeping a silent ledger of your own, quietly measuring your relationship against some idealized alternative without ever saying so, bring it into the open. An unspoken resentment never resolves. A named one at least has a chance to. And sixth, hold your own standards steady regardless of which way the market currently favors you. Scarcity is a bad reason to say yes, and so is a sudden abundance of options you haven't actually vetted. And seventh, catch yourself when you slip into treating your relationship like a competition to be scored against a hypothetical alternative, and redirect the question deliberately, not, "Could I have done better, but is this actually good on its own terms with this actual person?" None of this is about assuming the worst of anyone you're dating, and none of it is about assuming you finally deserve whatever attention shows up just because it's been a long time coming. It's about reading the actual relationship in front of you clearly, instead of reading it through a story about the market, your past, or anyone's demographic. So here's my question for you, and I want something specific in the comments. Have you noticed the kind of attention you're getting shift as you've gotten older? And once you actually looked at it clearly, was it about you or about circumstance? This has been Robbin for The Honest Ledger, the channel that reads the fine print nobody hands you. If this gave you a clearer way to read what's actually happening instead of just a feeling you couldn't name, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe if you want the rest of the ledger opened up one entry at a time.